All right, in my last video we talked about turning off the low pass filters because they really aren't doing too much. But it begs the question, can we turn off the dynamic notch? Is the RPM notches enough for the gyro in itself and just have some low passes on the D term? Well, let's take a look. All right, in front of us we have two different logs. This one over here has the dynamic notch enabled with no low passes on the driver, and you can see I have some pretty high D gains. You can see the PID gains here. If I scroll down here, you can see no low passes here. Do have the dynamic notch and the RPM notches turned on, and then just a low pass on the D term. Here's the same exact settings, except for here I do not have the dynamic notch turned on at all. You just have the low pass filters here. Here you can see down here the dynamic filter is turned off in this one, and here it's enabled in this one. So again, as before I did in other videos, I just took the two different logs and did zoom out, just go into here and take this zoom slider all the way to 10. We're looking at trace setup number 4 on both, and you can see the end results here. So let's pop this open here. This is the spectrogram of the D term on the roll axis. So that's this trace right here on both of these logs. And you can see this massive spike that the dynamic notch was killing out that is no longer being killed out. And the RPM filters aren't going to hit that because it's not related to motor RPM, it's a frame resonance. And how do I know that? Well, the first way to know that is you can simply just take this drop down, this frequency, you can set it to frequency versus throttle. And then when I'm going to expand this window here, you can see that it switches over. Sometimes when you do that, it doesn't switch and you have to run another, you have to click the legend on another trace and then come back and click the trace you actually want to see it. And you can see here that since we're looking at the D term, this is this resonance right up through here, and it's irrespective of the throttle percentage. So you can see at 20% throttle, we have this spike, and all the way up to 80%. It tails up a little bit as the motor RPMs are going up, but it's not the classic motor vibration band that we'd normally see. Generally, kind of like a 45-degree angle, it's over here. Now, if I pop over this log, so the one with no dynamic notch turned on, the debug mode, I was recording to see the different levels, as I did in the last video, the different levels of noise filtering as it goes through the filter chain. When you turn the dynamic notch off, it doesn't capture anything. You can see the debug traces here are 0. So I don't have any raw noise, but this is the same quad, same all the settings, same, it's just 2 packs back to back, just with different settings. So I'm going to pop over to the one with the dynamic notch turned on, and if I go to my debug mode trace here, which is trace UAV Tech trace template 6 on our keys there, you can see right here we have the gyro signal raw noise, and that's going to be on the roll axis. You can kind of see here the noise spectrograph. So what we're going to do is turn the intensity up a little bit on this so we can see it more clear. And you can see this is your RPM motor band, right? So this obviously is what the RPM notches are focusing on. So as the throttle goes up, those RPM notches are going from 200 hertz up to 400, all the way up to around, 425, 450 hertz at 100% throttle, and then they're ramping back down as you're decreasing throttle. But this band of vibration here, you can see that's irrespective of throttle position, is right around, it does vary a little bit, it's like 230 up to 250-ish, and that stays pretty consistent all the way up through. Very consistent between 0% and say 50% throttles. And you can see this is where people sometimes get those MTOs, where you have this frame resonance that starts to align with your RPM as you're increasing throttle, and they generally seem to start to align right around the 250 mark, and it's generally around 30 to 40, 50% throttle. And those two things kind of come together, and it causes even more vibration because it's all oscillating together, and we call those MTOs, mid-throttle oscillations. So you can kind of see what's going on when you have MTOs. It's two things kind of synchronizing up at the same spot and at a certain throttle percentage, and that's why you get more vibrations and more shakes at that point. Of course, another tool we have is PID Toolbox to look at this, and this is a log where we have that special debug mode again. So this debug trace 1 here, debug trace 1, and this is the raw noise and the roll axis. Now this is the log where I had the normal setup, where I had the 1.5 on the gyro and D-term filter sliders, dynamic notch and RPM notches turned on. And you can see that resonance line comes right through here, and I can hit this little indicator here and you can see that that's the 230 mark, and up here it moves up to around 240. So that's that same peak we're seeing. And So I went back to look at this to make sure it's not an artifact of something else, but you can see it's even there with the classic filter setup. It's just obviously and it's not really an issue with turning off the low pass filters since they really do so little on the gyro. However, with the dynamic notch, that's seeing that peak and sitting right on it and following it a little bit as it moves up and down slightly between 230 and 240, 250 hertz. But if we turn the dynamic notch off, there's nothing really to hit that big spike. Now, coming back to the log that has the dynamic notch and the low pass filters on the gyro turned off, you can see we get some pretty gnarly traces here. If I go to 100% zoom, this is no good. You can see how the D term is really magnifying the devil out of that. So it really comes back to, in my filter tuning strategy for Betaflight 4.1, it's the same for 4.2, is, you can turn your low passes off. They don't really hit any peaks of noise. They kind of just bring the ambient noise level down. So if I'm looking at a spectrograph to kind of put that in those terms, a low pass filter is just going to take this peak and all the noise on either side of it and just kind of bring it down a little bit. And I showed that in the previous video from this week. I'll make a card to that if you haven't seen that one. But it's not really going to kill out the peak. You need notch filters to do that, the RPM or the dynamic notch. And in this case, we kind of need both because we have that motor band that needs the RPM notches. And what's nice about the RPM filter and the RPM notches is that frees up the dynamic notch a little bit more to sit on stuff like this, that frame resonance, and really tackle that. So there's more to RPM filtering than just those filters itself. It's the component that it frees up the dynamic notch to then look for frame resonance peaks, sit and track those independently, where the RPM notches are just sticking to the motors, bent props, things of that nature. That's a common thing I do see as well, that people talk about, hey, what if I have bent props? But you got to keep in mind, bent props still spin at the motor RPM, so their magnitude of the oscillation is just bigger, but it's still relative to the motor RPM. So final thing to look at, this is a comparison of the two logs with the dynamic notch turned on, which is log B, and then with the dynamic notch turned off, which is log A. And you can see on B, we can have the raw noise here, so you can see that harmonic coming through right through here, and then the motor noise right here that the RPM filters are hitting. In this specific quad, since we have that harmonic resonance, frame resonance, or whatever this is, we're going to need that dynamic notch. That's a peak of noise that needs to be attenuated by some sort of notch. And since the RPM notches aren't going to be able to address that since they're tracking with the RPMs, we're going to need some other type of notch, either a static or, why would you do a static if you have a dynamic one that can track it a little bit? Here you can obviously see this is the gyro signal and how that frame resonance, there's a little bit of it there, but it's getting crushed out pretty well. And over here you can see with the dynamic notch turned off, that's allowed to come through since it's not within the motor vibration band, and then obviously that's filtering through into the D term. The D term is just at 250 hertz is just amplifying it like crazy and sending all kinds of bad signals to our ESCs, making the ESCs work harder and warmer. It's sending electrical signals to our motors, which are going to warm those up, and all kinds of bad things. So the bottom line, can I turn the dynamic notch off and just run RPM filters on the gyro and just some low passes on the D term? Yes and no. Yes, you can if you just have RPM peaks of noise to deal with. But if you have a quad that has frame resonances, then no, you can't. You're going to need that dynamic notch to jump on those frame resonances. It would really be nice if the dynamic notch could detect if those things become above, say, maybe a certain threshold and then turn itself on automatically. Or an example here, it literally looks like between 0 and say 60% throttle, there's that resonance it needs to hit. And maybe even here it might go away because, be 30 to 50% throttle because the RPM filters are right at that same spot. However, when that peak comes back, say down here, let's say 30% throttle and lower, that the dynamic notch turns itself on to jump on that peak. That's a great idea. Maybe somebody's already looking at that. More to come on that subject, hopefully here in a little bit. Well, everybody, that is it. As always, thanks, and I hope this helped.